Welcome to a new series on the history of offense in American football. I'll be going through several periods of football from the first game between Princeton and Rutgers in 1869 to present day. This first video will cover how offensive football evolved from 1869 to 1894, the beginning. There is some overlap here with the early American college football history playlist, but those videos were some of the first I did, and I hope I've upped my game since then. This period of football was incredibly violent and included the most amazing, spectacular play in the history of college football. I'll get to that towards the end. Now, the easiest way to understand early football is to take everything you know about football right now and throw it right out of your head, because it took decades for the game to become what we know now. And a lot of the stuff that happened back then doesn't even look like football. The first intercollegiate college football game, as recognized, was played in 1869 between Princeton and Rutgers. And it really didn't look like anything like what we know of football today. There were 25 players on each side, and the players could not pick up the ball. The ball could only be advanced by being kicked or butted with the head. It sounds a lot like they played soccer, but the man with the ball was surrounded by interference or a mob of blockers. I like to think of it as a combination of mob football and soccer, something that would resemble the playground game Kill the Carrier, or if you're a certain age, we called it something else. It must have been a somewhat brutal game, as a Rutgers professor was said to have been disgusted as he waved his umbrella at the participants and screamed, "You will come to no Christian end," and then apparently went away. No matter the description, it was unlike anything that resembled the football we know today. One wonders why it's considered the first football game, but I suppose you had to start somewhere. It wasn't long before teams realized they needed standardized rules, as they were beginning to play each other more often, and out of that came a rules committee. In 1880, the rules were changed so there were 11 people on a side instead of 15. Also in 1880 comes the concept of putting the ball in play or snapping the ball back with the foot. This rule introduces the concept of possession. In 1882, the concept of downs is introduced, so that a team at that time could have 3 consecutive plays, and if they did not advance the ball more than 5 yards or lose 10 yards, then they had to turn the ball over to the other team at the spot of the last down. These rules alter the game of football forever. Parkhill Davis describes how the game changed in his book, Football, the American Collegiate Game, published in 1912. These radical amendments was the rule prohibiting the defensive rush line from clasping hands and stretching out across the field like a chain, and the rule which extended tackling from the waist to the knees. Up to this time, rush lines on offense had stretched across the field so widely that the players could touch one another only with outstretched arms. Occasionally, the distance would be greater. The backs played far back and as far out as their ends, taking the ball on long side passes. Defensively, the rush line spread so as to cover opponents. The low tackle had introduced a defensive weapon into the game so powerful that the day of individual rushing and easy dodging was gone. To restore the balance between the offense and defense, the rush line was now contracted until the men stood shoulder to shoulder and the backs were brought up within 4 yards of the line for the quick plunges into the line that the new game required. And thus passed the beautiful open style of game recalled so fondly by the older generation of collegians, and in its place came the mass play, ugly and uncouth in construction, but which designed to be useful rather than handsome, overcame the low tackle, and won its long list of victories. So basically, instead of being stretched across the field, teams assembled themselves into masses. Also around this time, player positions were being named. From Allison Danzig, The History of American Football. The first man in the line originally was called the end rush, a heritage from our rugby comrades of England. The genius of young America at first designated the second man in the line as the next to end, the third man in the line as next to center, and the center, of course, as the center. It was quickly noticed, however, that the next to end made more tackles than any other man in the line, so he quickly became known as the tackler, a name later changed to tackle. Similarly, with the snapping back of the ball by the center with his foot, it was noticed that the next to center guarded the center by bracing the latter, hence the next to center came to be called the guard. A little confusing, perhaps, but an ample description of where the position names came from for the lines. The original formation of American football was the T formation, also referred to as the regular formation, around 1882. The formation was a direct result of the rules changes, as Davis stated. The rush line was now contracted until the men stood shoulder to shoulder and the backs were brought up within 4 yards of the line for the quick plunges into the line that the new game required. The regular formation didn't last long, as other more devastating formations would replace it. In 1884, the V trick, or the Princeton V as it would become interchangeably known, is introduced in the Princeton pen game from Davis. Tactically, this was the year that produced the famous V trick, the original wedge and forerunner of the mass play. Strange to say, this highly ingenious and complicated formation was not the result of long and laborious study, but was conceived suddenly in the crisis of a close game and put into immediate execution. The game was the contest between Pennsylvania and Princeton, October 25, 1884, and the inventor of the play was R.M. Hodge, 86, of Princeton. The latter has given this account of the origin of this great formation. In the middle of the game, Captain Byrd of Princeton had called upon Baker, 85, a halfback, to run behind the brush line, which charged 7 abreast down the field. It was an old play and gained little ground against Pennsylvania the second time it was used. It suddenly struck me that if the rush line would jump into the shape of a V with the apex forward and with Baker inside, the formation ought to gain ground. A consultation immediately was held, and upon the next play the formation tried. Baker plowing forward within the V from midfield to the 5-yard line. We then reserved this formation for the Yale game, Lamar making within it a long gain on the opening play. The next year, the V was not used, but was revived in 1886. By 1888, it had come into general use throughout the country, and in 1889 was the standard opening play with every 11. You might wonder how teams went about defending against such mass formations. From Danzig. On the Yale team was a young giant by the name of Walter Hefflefinger. He rushed at the mighty human engine, leaped high in the air, completely clearing its forward ramparts, and came down on top of the men inside the wedge, whom he flattened to the ground, and among them the ball carrier. Now, another method of defense against the mass was for the man at the point of attack to throw himself under the oncoming mass. So imagine yourself about to be run over by 9 or 10 guys. You have to stop them, so you throw yourself under the point of the wedge to purposely cause a pileup, and then you get up, line up, and do this over and over again. In 1889, Walter Camp, the father of American football, comes up with the shoving wedge. Football historian Alexander Wayan described Camp's formation in the Saga of American Football, published in 1955. The players ranged themselves in a wedge with only the center on the line of scrimmage. Each man placed his hands on the hip of the man in front. When the ball was snapped, the players closed in tight and shoved. The ball carrier was protected on all sides. In 1891, another formation called the turtleback is developed. And honestly, I have a hard time visualizing this play in my head. Davis describes it as thus: a play executed by forming the 11 men in the shape of a solid oval against a selected point in the rush line, usually the tackle, and at the snap of the ball into the interior of the oval, rolling the mass out around the end, thus unwinding the runner into a clear field. 1892 saw the introduction of the most devastating and amazing play in the history of football, the Flying Wedge. From Anatomy of a Game by David Nelson comes a description of the play. The Flying Wedge, an infamous football play often used as the prime example of early football's violent character, entered the game at the second half kickoff of the 1892 Harvard-Yale game. The kickoff at that time could be dribbled, a practice carried over from soccer, and then picked up and carried or passed backward to a teammate. The Flying Wedge was a surprise because for many years all teams had used the Princeton V as the standard opening play. The unexpected play was the brainchild of Harvard chess wizard Loren F. DeLand. His kickoff gambit endangered players of both teams and forced the rules makers to check the most notorious of all mass momentum plays. The play began with Harvard's B.W. Trafford holding the ball at Harvard's 45-yard line. The remaining 10 Harvard players divided into two groups and assembled near the sideline on Harvard's 25-yard line. Trafford waved his hand and the two groups started running at full speed toward him. When they reached him, he put the ball in play and disappeared within the mass of 10 teammates. The play went to the Yale 25-yard line. It was one of the few things Harvard did right during the game, since they lost 6-0. Although the Flying Wedge did not score, it was discussed across the country and was a rules committee concern until it was ruled illegal 2 years later in 1894. After 1894, the kickoff was required to travel 10 yards before a member of the kicking team could recover it. An article from the Philadelphia Inquirer, November 27, 1893, mentions Harvard's battering ram play. Harvard depended mainly on her battering ram play to gain ground for her, and her men were worn out in the first half by this work. The play was made this way. The two tackles, the fullback and the left halfback, would go back from the line about 8 yards, and then as the signal was given, they would crash at the opposing forwards, usually striking between tackle and guard. When this human catapult would hit the line, Waters, with the ball, would come from the right side and Mackey would whirl him through the opening. Harvard gained ground by this trip to some extent in the first half, but her men were being used up very fast. Waters was knocked insensible in the first half and played in a dazed condition during the remainder of the game. Now, remember what I said earlier about throwing everything you know about football out of your head? This is what I'm talking about. The Flying Wedge existed because there were no rules on how many players had to be on the line of scrimmage. Line of scrimmage? It didn't exist. And there's no rule on being set before the ball is snapped. Therefore, you could take several men, put them as far as back as you like, and run them at a single attack point in the defense. And again, imagine these guys that are at the attack point on defense. You have a whole gob of men running at full speed at you. And you do this over and over and over for the course of 60 to 70 minutes for a game. It's a little crazy. The book, A Scientific and Practical Treatise on American Football, by Amos, Alonzo, Stag, and Henry L. Williams, was published in 1894. Stag was the coach of the University of Chicago Maroons and one of the most influential coaches in college football history. Williams became known for coaching at the University of Minnesota and inventing the Minnesota shift offense, which we'll cover in the next video. The book was the first to include play diagrams, some of which you've already seen in this video. 69 of them, many of which feature linemen, guards, tackles, and ends carrying the ball. And again, there's no rule about how many players have to be on the line at this time. And there are some wild-looking plays, such as play 25, crisscross halfback play around the end. Or play 38, slow mass wedge from a down. The men spring to their positions in the wedge formation the instant the signal is given. Notice they don't say immediate when the ball is put in play. Play 40, revolving wedge from a down. The ball is put in play immediately and the entire wedge plunges straight forward in a closely compact body. Play 41, lifting wedge through the center. The fullback gets the ball from center and then rams his head down low between the hips of the center and the left guard, at which point they lustily yell, "Now!" and lift the fullback in the air for 3 or 4 seconds, pushing forward. So they're literally carrying a guy through the line. Play 65, crisscross play from the sideline. To perform the crisscross play when the ball is out of bounds at the sideline, center places one foot well within the field, keeping the other foot out of bounds, and faces the opponent's goal with the ball in his hands, ready to put it in play by touching it to the ground and passing it back between his legs to the quarterback. But amongst these plays in that book, there are also plays that are the forerunners of future football. Play 26, end crisscrosses with halfback in play around the end, a forerunner of the reverse. Play 52, double pass opening play from center, basically the equivalent of a pitch play. Keep in mind, a pass at this time is what we call a lateral because the forward pass is not yet legal. On May 8, 1894, mass momentum plays like the Flying Wedge would come to an end. The Rules Committee passed a rule stating, no momentum mass play will be allowed. A momentum mass play is one in which more than 3 men start before the ball is put in play. Nor shall more than 3 men group for that purpose more than 5 yards back of the point where the ball is put in play. Now, another rule is established to require the ball to go at least 10 yards on a kickoff. This eliminates plays like the Flying Wedge and the Princeton V on kickoffs. Note that while the rule outlawed momentum mass plays, it did not outlaw mass play. This could continue to be a very deadly form of football, leading directly to crises in both 1905 and 1909, crises that would nearly end the game of football. Now, the first 25 years of college football saw massive change as the sport tried to find itself. The early rules changes led to a lot of innovation in offensive and formation football before the idea of the forward pass was even being considered as part of the game. Stay tuned for more as we advance through the years. Any feedback is welcome and certainly encouraged. I'm John Johnston, and this is Hardcore College Football History. Please consider supporting me on Patreon, as I would like to have more resources for making even better history videos. Thank you.